Welcome to Rise, Hope and Healing After Sexual Betrayal. Healing from sexual betrayal is not something you are meant to do alone. I am your hostess, MaryAnn Michaelis, and each week we feature conversations with experts in betrayal trauma recovery. If this podcast is helpful to you, we ask that you please share it so that someone else may not feel so alone. You can also find our companion course at humanintimacy.com. We're so glad that you're with us. Hi, everyone. I'm MaryAnn, and I'm so glad that you're here with me today. And usually I have another guest joining me for a conversation, but for today's podcast, it's just me. And if you've been following this podcast, you know that we've been focusing and looking at the different components of grief and loss, especially related to betrayal. There's not a lot of research in this area. So as we began these conversations on grief, I created a survey called the Grief After Betrayal Impact Scale or Survey. And we've invited listeners to give us their feedback. And I wanted to share with you, our listeners and viewers, some of those results and some of those slides that I presented at the Human Intimacy Conference. If you'd like to access a more in-depth portrayal of these, you can access them at the Human Intimacy website. So if you're a listener, I'm going to explain it. And I also invite you to go to youtube.com/human-intimacy if you'd like to see the visuals. I really want to thank everybody who took some time to share their experiences. And if you haven't yet, we'll have a link in the show notes. Because this is ongoing, we'll continue to utilize this as a tool. So just before I share my screen, I want to talk about just a couple of limitations. Anytime we're talking about any research or data, we have to really look at limitations. What did we maybe miss? What are some factors that would be important to look at as we're interpreting this data? So first of all, I want to recognize that we posted this in several places on social media and several support groups, some 12-step groups. We shared it with several therapists and asked them to share it. And also with the CSAT community saying, hey, will you please share this? So as we're looking at the demographics of the people who completed this survey, most of them were probably connected to a support group for betrayal trauma, or they were connected to a therapist in some way, shape, or form. And so we need to recognize that there might be some privilege there of the people who took it. And they may have had more access to resources, access to therapists, access to support groups. Also, we only had 3 people who identified as male. 1 preferred not to say. And I want to make sure that I'm framing what we're seeing, what we'll be looking at. So because there aren't a lot of resources, support groups, and there's often a lot of shame around men who have been betrayed, the primary respondents were white or Caucasian females. As I share my screen, one of the questions we asked was, how long has it been since you experienced discovery? And there's a range from 1 to 4 weeks ago, ranging to more than 25 years ago. The largest bar on this graph is at about 10 to 15 years. The second highest is 2 to 5 years, and then 5 to 10 years. Our lowest is 3 to 6 months. And then our highest is over 25 years. So we've got an average of people between 2 to 5 years or 5 to 15 years who are the main respondents in this survey. So this just tells us a little bit more about the people who took this survey. Then we're looking at the number of how many disclosures did people have after discovery or after disclosure. And the primary number that we see is 30% said 2 to 3, and 15% said 4 to 6, 11% said 7 to 10, and 11% said more than 10. And 8% said unsure, lost count. 12% said 1, and 12% said none. So that lets us know that 30% have at least had 2 to 3 discoveries or disclosures. And when we're looking at a staggered disclosure, here's more information, here's more information, here's more information, that's really typical and common and really damaging and difficult. Then we're looking at, did you discover this or did somebody share it with you? Because there is belief that oftentimes it is much more damaging for a betrayed partner to have discovered the betrayal on their own versus when their spouse or partner comes and says, I need to be honest with you. This is what's been going on. So, looking at this, 47% of the people who responded to this question said that they found it on their own. Only 6% said that their partner disclosed it voluntarily, and 25% said that my partner disclosed only after they were confronted. 17% said somebody else told me. So we know that oftentimes individuals are discovering the disclosure. Next, we asked, how long did it take to recognize grief? 38% said immediately. Our next highest, 17%, said more than 12 months, and 15% said within 6 months. So we know some found it immediately, and some within 6 months to a year were able to say, oh, this is grief. And 12% said only after somebody else pointed this out. So we might be seeing it immediately, or it might take a year to before we even recognize we were grieving. Next, we're going to be heading into some questions that are really looking at where were you before, where were you after, and ask what did your self-confidence look like before betrayal and after betrayal. The average of people were saying, I feel like I was at about a 6 out of 7 in my self-confidence versus 2 out of 7 after they discovered or after the betrayal. So we see the significant drop in confidence in myself. And so this next screen, we asked 8 questions looking at identity and self-worth before and after the betrayal. And we just wanted to see what changes and how big are the changes. So when we said, how well did you feel like you were aligned with your values before the discovery? We had 84% and then it dropped to 48. How well did you feel like you had a clear sense of your identity? Started at 80% before it dropped to 26. This is really important because this is our lowest drop. So we went from 80% to a 26, feeling like I know who I am. I know where I am in the world. That's huge, huge drop. How well did you feel connected to yourself and others? Went from 80% to 33%. How consistent did you feel that you were in your life? Went from 83% to 39%. And then we asked, how valuable did you see or feel that you were as a person? That you went from 76% to 31%. So we're seeing here this internalization of who I am, my worth, and my value as a person. Our next question said, how worthy of love, care, and belonging did you feel? 76% before betrayal, 47% after the discovery. The next one, how well did you trust yourself and believe that you made good decisions? Went from 81% before to 36% after. So here we have another big drop. And then how proud of yourself and your choices did you feel? So before betrayal was 81 and after betrayal was 63. So of all of the impacts, we see that sense of identity ripped away and value as a person. Both have really significant drops there. So we're understanding that betrayal impacts how I see myself in the world, how I see my value. In our next slide, we are looking at our relational worthiness, how we feel that we are related to our worthiness. And self-blame, really, this is looking at shame. We asked these questions in reverse just to double check. And so we asked, how insecure in the relationship did you feel before the betrayal? 37% said they felt insecure. And after betrayal, almost 80%. So we've got this huge drop from feeling secure to now I feel totally insecure. Then we asked, how did you feel regarding unworthiness of love with your partner? It went from 31% to 59%. And then how much did you blame yourself for the problems in your relationship with your partner? It went from 45% before betrayal to 42% after. So there was actually a drop in there. Maybe these weren't my problems. Maybe all of this wasn't about me. In our next slide, we were asking, please let us know what was your greatest grief and loss that you experienced. And so in this space, our biggest loss was a loss of trust. And as we looked at that later on, we saw loss of trust in self, loss of trust in partner. And our second greatest one is loss of the relationship that I thought that I had. And then we see loss of emotional safety. So we're seeing these losses that need to be grieved. The loss of, now who do I trust? How do I know who is safe to trust? And the relationship that I thought I had that I trusted, now I don't even know what that is anymore. So we're also looking at that loss of the future that I had. This is so destabilizing to an individual. And I think it's really important that we're recognizing the destabilization that occurs, the loss of understanding who I am, where I fit in the world, everything that I thought that I knew, I don't know anymore. In our next slide, we asked, how many people did you share with or ask for support? And our highest number there, 25% said they told 4 to 5 people. 23% told 2 to 3 people. And 20% told 6 to 10 people. We add those together and we get 68%, which is a large number, and 14% told no one. When we're looking at betrayal, we're looking at this through this realm of, I just had my whole world kicked out from underneath me and I don't know who I am and I don't feel good about myself and I see myself through a new lens. And then we ask, how many people did you share with that this was going on and ask for support? 68% said, I didn't tell very many people. 14%, I didn't tell anybody at all. That's concerning to me and heartbreaking to me as well. So we have so many people who are wounded and who are hurting. The next question is once again looking at support. How many times did you tell your story? And 39% of the people said 3 to 5 times. 25% said 6 to 10 times. And we had 18% that said more than 20 times. 9% said only 1 to 2 times. 2% said 0 times. So telling our story, having safe places to tell our story is such an important part of healing because it helps us to be able to make sense of our reality. We call it creating your trauma narrative. And so understanding that we need to find safe places to make sense of our reality. In our next set of questions, we were really helping us understand this demographic. We said, what kind of supports did you use? 82% of the people who took this survey said that they used individual therapy. Our next highest one, 73% said books, podcasts, online resources. 68% said they used close friends. And then we dropped down to couples therapy, trauma-informed betrayal trauma support groups. 55% said they used family members. 36% said that they used church or their faith leaders. 30% said they used a 12-step group, and 20% said medical providers. So it looks like people go to individual therapy first, and then they go to books or online podcasting or together with that, and close friends. Those are our highest places that people are turning and looking for support. So if that's you, thank you for being here. I'm so grateful and humbled to be part of your journey. Then we looked at, how do you feel towards your partner, the person who betrayed you? Our highest percentage there, 21% said, we're trying but significantly struggling. 16% said extremely hopeful and actively working on it. And then we had 14% that said hopeful but still unsure. So if we're adding that up, we're looking at more than 50% that are hopeful or trying but still struggling. And then 50% are things aren't going really well. They're detached or conflicted, coexisting, actively separating, feels burned to the ground, or the relationship is over, or no contact. Then we asked, how well did mental health therapists in supporting your grief? 10% said they didn't even identify my grief. 7% said a little bit. 25% said they somewhat identified it and supported it. I look at that and say, wow, we've got about 42% saying, I didn't really get a whole lot of help understanding that this is grief and working through the grief. On the other hand, we've got 25% and 33% that say, Yeah, my therapist did see it. They supported it. They helped with that. And that's fantastic. We asked how helpful were the books, the podcasts, the resources, the educational resources, and our highest number there was 2%. Very helpful. So we're saying, okay, we've got a high majority of people looking for resources. They are finding them being mostly or moderately helpful. That's a positive thing. We talked about the support groups. How helpful were they? 31% said extremely helpful. 22% said very helpful, and 22% said moderately helpful. This underscores that we need support. So we need to find groups of places where we can show up with our story. Now, this next question is really interesting because it asked how helpful were your church or spiritual or religious leaders. 50% said not helpful at all. 30% said slightly helpful. So we're looking at 80% saying not really, 10% moderately helpful, and 11% that was saying that it was very helpful or extremely helpful, which to me says that we need to do better with educating our religious clergy, faith leaders, and helping support. So next slide, we're asking overall, when you combine all of these resources, how supportive have you felt? And across the board, slightly, moderately, and extremely are all about 23%, and then various 28%. So we're saying, okay, this one's kind of evenly split. For some people, it was really helpful. For some people, it was helpful. And for some, it was okay. We then wanted to shift and look at impacts on the body. So we asked about appetite changes. 61% of people who took this survey said that their appetite was impacted, that they ate less. And that makes so much sense with our fight or flight nervous system. As we understand the polyvagal theory, when we go into fight, flight, or freeze, our reproductive system and our digestive system shuts off. And so that makes a lot of sense to see that 61% were saying, yeah, that impacted that. 12% said that it went up. 27% said, it wasn't a significant change either way. And then we look at weight changes. 38% said they had a significant weight loss, more than 5% of their body weight. 19% said that they had weight gain, and 45% said no significant change. So we're seeing that 55% had impact to their weight when they experienced betrayal. Then we asked about sleep changes. 30% said they had difficulty falling asleep, and 53% said they had a really hard time staying asleep, that they were waking up quite a bit. And this is really impactful because what we know about sleep is that it impacts our mood. And we know if we had a bad night of sleep the night before, the way that we see the world the next day will be more gloomy. We will be less able to feel and experience joy and happiness. And that's directly related to our sleep. And so we're seeing here that 83% of the people who experienced betrayal had problems with their sleep. That ties into the PTSD criteria when we're seeing nightmares, flashbacks, and the triggers. And so there's a direct correlation there to how well we're working with our emotional regulation, how we're responding to things, how we're coping and managing, tying back to the sleep. Most of us can't control our sleep. Once again, this is another impact of the grief and loss of the betrayal. Then we asked about skin and hair changes, and we had some hair loss that was thinning. We had some skin rashes. 43% said that they didn't have significant changes.
We asked about health concerns that had been experienced in the past 2 years. 6% said that they had had cancer. 15% said that they had had autoimmune disorders. 31% indicated mental health diagnoses. 4% diabetes or prediabetes, and 4% cardiovascular or heart health. And for our final question in this section, we asked if the respondents felt like these health concerns were related to grief or stress from the betrayal. And 59% said it was definitely related, and added it all together, 82% of the individuals who took this are saying this had an impact on my health.
Finally, we had some open-ended questions, and one of the answers that came from the open-ended question, what's been the most painful for you? Was the most painful thing is grieving the years and years I felt unseen by my husband, the years I felt unsafe to share my real feelings with him, the years and years I felt like my value to him was mostly for sex. It's the decades of never being truly known by anyone. There's a line in a church song that says, "In the quiet heart is hidden sorrow that the eye can't see." That was my life for more than 2 decades. People saw and praised the good man my husband is, and outwardly our marriage looked great. But nobody saw my heart. Nobody could have guessed the heartache I felt. It's the invisibility. There's so much pain there. Now, I also want to share with you what we saw from the 3 people who identified as male. Looking at that open-ended question, what was the most painful? The male who just experienced betrayal within the last 3 to 6 months said rejection and powerless to help the partner address their sex addiction. Someone who 10 to 15 years since being betrayed said loss of innocence, someone using love as a weapon, and someone taking away my voice. And someone who had been betrayed 15 to 20 years said the most painful was loss of connection with my son, betrayal by my sisters and mother who marginalized me as my mother was dying. At least one sister sided with my ex. We asked, what did you need the most? The 3 to 6 month individual said, both clinical and friends helped to intervene on the partner's apparent sex addiction. 10 to 15 years later, individual said, someone to help me describe how I was feeling and what those emotions are. And 15 to 20 years, individual said, reconciliation was the great wish, but complicated by great distrust. And then we go to the impact of the self-worth 3 to 6 months since the disclosure. Said, initially I felt defective and unlovable. Through good therapy regarding family of origin issues, I recognized that I carried those beliefs since childhood and have since shed them. So it sounds like they've been getting some helpful therapy. The 10 to 15 months said, reliance on self-talk, rumination, to keep me wondering, my self-worth remains vulnerable. So the impact on their self-worth is that they are still struggling. And the individual who experienced betrayal 15 to 20 years ago said, my sense of worth has increased significantly over the years, but I am persistently haunted by an echo of irretrievable loss due to estrangement from my son and sisters. Shame and blame are not issues. I don't even blame my ex-wife, towards whom I feel compassion and sadness. However, I cannot interact with her as it has proven impossible without stirring my anger. So even 15 to 20 years later, there's these residual impacts that have been experienced. Now, before we wrap up, we asked what has been most painful for you to grieve. I began to tally up which words came out the most often, and I threw that into a word cloud. And on the screen, I'm showing a visual of a broken heart word cloud. And the primary words that came out were loss. So what has been the most painful for you to grieve? It's been the loss. It's been the trust. It's been the years, 19 years, 38 years, 41 years, 23 years were some of the years that showed up. So long-term years, and the loss and the pain of the reality that my life was not what I thought it was, that my identity of who I felt and thought that I was lost. The marriage that I thought I had was lost. The trust that I had in my partner, the way that I saw my partner, the way that I saw myself, what I had thought I had for forever, feeling fooled, thinking that what I had was special was gone. That word forever showed up multiple times. Relationship with God, and a lot of pain words. Disturbed, broken, destroyed, rejection, cheated, damaged, hurt, disconnect. These are some of the words that showed up as we looked at the greatest pains of the betrayal. We are trying to make sense of experiences that are deeply painful, that we don't often have words for or even know how to express. Really big emotions that show up that are so difficult to navigate through. And it's messy. This is very messy work. and we never have a template for it. This isn't something we expected or planned on, and yet here it is. It's changed our world, and we don't know how to get through it. I want to wrap up with a couple of words that come from Susan Anderson regarding grieving, and she says, all grief involves shame. Shame complicates the grieving process. It's one more way that we turn against ourselves. And abandonment is a powerful enough trauma to arouse our body's self-defense system, to reactivate our old emotional memories, and to create a temporary condition where our need for attachment is incredibly intense. We go through withdrawal from our partner. So coming to terms with reality, or with the reality of losing our loved one, is a real emotional crisis. And when we can do that, that helps us to avoid the shame trap, saying, I am experiencing a real emotional crisis. Giving ourselves that permission to see it that way helps us to shift out of that shame and this acceptance of I'm having a real emotional crisis is a really important step in becoming emotionally self-nurturing and finding a way to give kindness to ourselves. You've heard me say so many times talking about self-compassion, treating ourselves with loving kindness. That is so important here. I have been so humbled to look at this data, to try and make sense of it, and to be able to share it with you. And I will wrap up today by saying thank you if you participated in this survey. If you didn't, thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope that you feel validated. And I would love to invite you to take the survey just to add to the data. If this has been your experience, or if your experience has been different, we'd love to hear from you to be able to continue to learn and explore about this. Thank you for being here and for joining me today, and hope to see you next week. Take care of yourself. If this podcast has been helpful for you, we invite you to like it, to share it, to check out our YouTube page to help us grow our algorithms and to be able to help as many people as we can. Thank you